October 24th, 1929, 1030 a.m. The floor of the New York Stock Exchange. The air is thick with the smell of stale tobacco smoke and nervous sweat as trader William Crawford pushes through a frantic mob of men in three-piece suits. The deafening roar of shouting voices bounces off the marble walls, drowning out the ringing of the telephones that line the trading posts. Crawford glances up at the ticker tape projecting the stock prices, his heart hammering against his ribs, only to realize with a sickening jolt that the numbers are lagging behind the chaos unfolding on the floor. The panicked selling began almost immediately after the opening bell rang, creating a vortex of noise that seasoned veterans of Wall Street had never experienced before. Men who had been millionaires when they woke up that morning were now screaming orders to sell their holdings at any price, desperate to salvage pennies on the dollar. The sheer volume of trades overwhelmed the mechanical limitations of the ticker tape system, which meant that the prices flashing on the screens across the country were actually reflecting the reality of 20 minutes ago. This terrifying delay created a fog of war where no one knew the true value of their portfolio, fueling a feedback loop of blind terror and reckless liquidation. By noon on that fateful Thursday, the sense of order that usually governed the financial district had completely disintegrated into a primal scramble for survival. The trading floor was a sea of discarded paper, torn collars, and red faces screaming into the void of a market with no bottom. Rumors spread like wildfire through the crowd that major speculators were committing suicide by jumping from nearby skyscrapers, adding a grim, albeit exaggerated, layer of hysteria to the financial carnage. Outside on the steps of the Federal Hall, a massive crowd of concerned citizens and curious onlookers began to gather, their faces pressed against the stone railings as they tried to catch a glimpse of the disaster unfolding inside the temple of capitalism. In a desperate attempt to stem the bleeding, Richard Whitney, the vice president of the exchange and a man known for his aristocratic bearing, strode onto the floor at 1:30, representing a coalition of powerful bankers who had pooled their resources to save the market. Whitney loudly placed a bid to purchase 10,000 shares of WWII steel at a price well above the current market value. The calculated display of confidence momentarily stunned the room into silence, offering a brief glimmer of hope that the titans of finance could hold back the tide. For a few hours, the market stabilized, and the exhausted traders allowed themselves to believe that the worst of the storm had passed. However, the calm that followed over the weekend was merely an illusion, a temporary dam holding back a reservoir of devastating debt. Throughout Sunday, the telegraph wires hummed with margin calls sent by brokerage firms to thousands of average Americans who had bought stocks on credit. These investors, ranging from small-town grocers to elevator operators, had leveraged their livelihoods on the belief that the market could only go up. Now, they were being told to deposit immediate cash to cover their losses, money that simply did not exist. The realization that the banks would force the sale of their assets on Monday morning settled over the nation like a heavy, suffocating blanket. When the opening bell rang on Tuesday, October 29th, the dam finally broke with a violence that shattered the American economy. This was the day that would forever be known as Black Tuesday, the moment when the last vestiges of hope were extinguished by a relentless wave of selling orders. There were no white knights coming to save the market this time, as even the wealthy bankers were now scrambling to protect their own dwindling fortunes. The volume of shares traded was so immense that the ticker tape fell hours behind, meaning that a trader could sell a stock at noon and not know the actual transaction price until the evening, by which time they might be completely bankrupt. The physical toll on the workers inside the exchange was immense, with clerks fainting from exhaustion and dehydration as they tried to process the avalanche of paper. The floor was littered with ticker tape, order slips, and the debris of a financial system tearing itself apart, resembling a battlefield more than a place of business. Grown men wept openly as they watched the ticker symbols scroll by, each tick erasing years of hard work, family inheritances, and dreams of a comfortable retirement. The psychological shock was so profound that it paralyzed the decision-making of experienced investors, leaving them to watch in catatonic horror as their net worth evaporated into thin air. Beyond the stone walls of the exchange, the contagion began to spread rapidly to the streets of New York and beyond. The panic was not confined to the wealthy elite. for the crash exposed the dangerous fragility of an economy built on easy credit and speculative excess. As stock prices plummeted, the value of the collateral holding up thousands of bank loans disappeared, leaving the banks with bad debts and no liquidity. The fear of bank failures caused everyday citizens to rush their local branches, demanding to withdraw their savings in cash, further straining a financial system that was already cracking under the pressure. The frantic energy of the Roaring Twenties, characterized by jazz, flappers, and an unshakable belief in permanent prosperity, died a sudden and violent death that afternoon. The cultural shift was palpable, as the optimism of the jazz age was instantly replaced by a grim, grey reality of uncertainty and fear. High society parties that had been planned for weeks were cancelled or attended by guests who looked like ghosts, their conversations hushed and centered entirely on the catastrophe. The glittering skyline of Manhattan, once a symbol of limitless American ambition, now cast a long, ominous shadow over a city that was waking up to a nightmare. In the back offices of brokerage firms across the country, overworked clerks labored late into the night, trying to reconcile the accounts of thousands of ruined clients. The telegraph machines chattered incessantly, delivering the bad news to households in Chicago, San Francisco, and rural farmlands. For many families, the telegram was a death sentence for their way of life, marking the transition from the middle class to poverty in the span of a few hours. The abstract numbers on the ticker tape were translating into real-world consequences: foreclosed homes, repossessed cars, and the sudden inability to put food on the table. The mechanism of the crash was exacerbated by the common practice of buying on margin, which allowed an investor to purchase $10 of stock with only $1 of their own money. This leverage had amplified the gains during the boom years, creating a false sense of wealth that permeated every level of society. But on the way down, the leverage acted as a guillotine, magnifying the losses and leaving investors owing far more money than they had ever possessed. It was a brutal lesson in economics that stripped the dignity from honest, hard-working people who had simply followed the advice of the era to get rich quick. As the sun set on Black Tuesday, the streets of the financial district were eerily quiet, save for the shuffling of feet and the occasional siren. The lights of the skyscrapers burned late into the night, earning them the nickname of corpse candles, as accountants and managers tallied the unimaginable scale of the destruction. Billions of dollars in wealth had been wiped out in a matter of days, a sum that exceeded the cost of the Great War that had ended only a decade prior. The psychological trauma inflicted on the American consciousness that week would last for generations, instilling a deep-seated fear of poverty and a suspicion of financial markets. The immediate aftermath saw a paralysis of consumer spending, as those who still had money hoarded it in fear of what was to come. Factories that had been churning out automobiles and radios suddenly found their order books empty, leading to the first wave of layoffs that would eventually swell into an ocean of unemployment. The intricate web of credit that connected manufacturers, retailers, and consumers had been severed, causing the engines of commerce to grind to a screeching halt. The crash was not just a correction of overvalued stocks. It was a systemic failure that signaled the beginning of a long, dark winter for the global economy. In the days following the crash, the newspapers were filled with stories of despair, from the high-profile suicides of financiers to the quiet tragedies of families losing everything. The dark humor of the time surfaced in grim jokes, such as hotel clerks asking guests if they wanted a room for sleeping or for jumping, reflecting a society trying to process the trauma through cynicism. Yet beneath the dark humor lay a profound sense of betrayal. As the public realized that the captains of industry and political leaders who had promised eternal prosperity had been blind to the approaching cliff, the trust between the government and the governed had been broken, creating a vacuum that fear was all too eager to fill. The devastation on Wall Street was merely the first domino to fall in a chain reaction that would eventually engulf the entire world. While the traders and bankers were the first to feel the pain, the shockwaves were already traveling outward toward the industrial heartland and the sun-baked farms of the Midwest. The crash had destroyed the liquidity required to keep the wheels of industry turning, and soon the silence of the trading floor would be echoed by the silence of shuttered factories and abandoned fields. The Great Depression had arrived, not with a whimper, but with the thunderous collapse of the American dream. setting the stage for a decade of suffering that would test the very soul of the nation. April 14th, 1935. The afternoon sky over the Oklahoma Panhandle is a deceptively brilliant blue, masking the monster that is gathering strength on the northern horizon. In the small town of Boise City, a young farmer named Arthur Tiller looks up from his rusted tractor, his eyes squinting against the harsh glare of the sun. The air suddenly drops in temperature, a chilling prelude that sends the birds into a frantic, confused silence before they scatter in every direction. Tiller watches in paralyzed horror as the horizon is swallowed by a towering wall of blackness, a mountain of churning earth 10,000 feet high, moving toward him with the speed of a freight train. This was the arrival of the Black Sunday storm, the most terrifying meteorological event in a decade defined by environmental collapse. The storm did not just darken the sky, it obliterated the sun completely, plunging the middle of the day into a midnight darkness so absolute that people could not see their own hands in front of their faces. The roaring wind carried millions of tons of topsoil, stripped from the plains of Texas, Kansas, and Colorado, and blasted it against the fragile wooden siding of farmhouses. Inside, families huddled together under kitchen tables with wet rags pressed over their mouths, struggling to breathe as the fine silt forced its way through every crack and keyhole. The catalyst for this apocalypse was not merely a shift in the weather patterns, but a tragedy of human hubris and economic greed born during the previous decade. During the First World War, with wheat prices skyrocketing, farmers had been encouraged to plow up millions of acres of resilient native buffalo grass to plant crops. This great plow-up had removed the ancient root systems that anchored the soil to the earth, leaving the land naked and vulnerable. When the rains stopped and the drought set in during the early 1932, the sun baked the exposed soil into a fine powder that the relentless prairie winds could lift and carry for thousands of miles. Life inside the Dust Bowl became a surreal existence where the simple act of breathing was a daily battle for survival against the elements. The dust was inescapable. It coated the food on the dinner table, turned the water in the cisterns into mud, and gritted between the teeth of sleeping children. Women fought a losing war against the dirt, hanging wet sheets over windows that would turn black with soot within an hour, while the static electricity generated by the storms was so intense that blue sparks would arc from barbed wire fences and disable the ignition systems of automobiles. The psychological toll was immense, driving some to madness as the relentless howling of the wind denied them even a moment of peace. The physical health of the population began to deteriorate rapidly, giving rise to a new and deadly plague known medically as dust pneumonia. The fine silica particles inhaled by the residents acted like ground glass in the lungs, causing inflammation and fluid buildup that proved fatal, especially for the very young and the elderly. Red Cross nurses, wearing masks that quickly clogged with dirt, moved from house to house, finding children coughing up black mud in rooms where the dust lay inches thick on the floor. It was a slow, suffocating death that struck terror into the hearts of parents who felt powerless to protect their families from the very air they breathed. Outside the suffocating farmhouses, the livestock that formed the backbone of the agricultural economy were suffering a fate just as gruesome. Cattle, blinded by the blowing sand and starving for lack of grazing grass, wandered aimlessly until they collapsed from exhaustion or suffocated as their lungs filled with dirt. Farmers were forced to make the heart-wrenching decision to shoot their own herds to spare them further misery, leaving the carcasses to be buried by the shifting dunes. The federal government eventually stepped in with a grim program to purchase and slaughter starving cattle, a desperate measure that underscored the total collapse of the region's ecosystem. While the land turned against the farmers, the economic machinery of the Great Depression delivered the final, knockout blow to their way of life. The crash of 1929 had caused crop prices to plummet to levels where it cost more to harvest the wheat than the grain was worth on the market. With no income and their fields turned to deserts, farmers could not pay the mortgages on their land or the loans for their equipment. The local banks, themselves teetering on the brink of insolvency, began to foreclose on the properties, sending sheriffs to evict families who had worked the same soil for generations. The auction block became a common sight of public humiliation and collective mourning in rural communities across the Great Plains. Neighbors gathered in silence as the auctioneer sold off the physical remnants of a family's existence: the plough, the mules, the kitchen table, and the children's bed frames. The prices fetched were insulting, pennies on the dollar, as no one in the crowd had any real money to spend. Sometimes, in acts of defiance known as penny auctions, neighbors would bid a few cents for a farm and then return it to the original owner, threatening the bank agents with violence if they tried to intervene. But these victories were rare and temporary. Faced with the twin terrors of starvation and homelessness, hundreds of thousands of families made the desperate decision to pack up and leave. They became known as Okies or Arkies, derogatory terms that lumped together refugees from Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, and Texas into a single class of unwanted migrants. They piled their meager possessions onto rickety Model T Fords or converted flatbed trucks, tying mattresses to the roofs and squeezing children, grandparents, and dogs into the cramped cabins. They left behind the graves of their ancestors and the only homes they had ever known, turning their faces west toward the rumored paradise of California. Route 66, the legendary Mother Road, became a river of misery flowing across the American Southwest. Clogged with the jalopies of the displaced, the journey was a grueling test of endurance, with cars constantly overheating in the desert sun or breaking down under the weight of the household goods. With no money for repairs, fathers became roadside mechanics, patching tires with rags and fixing engines with baling wire, while mothers tried to stretch a loaf of bread to feed a family of 6. The road created a unique transient community, where families camped together in roadside ditches, sharing stories of the homes they lost and rumors of the work they hoped to find. However, the rumors of high wages and abundant jobs in California were a cruel mirage, often fueled by handbills distributed by large commercial farms looking to flood the labor market to drive down wages. As the migrants approached the California border, they were not greeted with open arms, but with hostility and suspicion from the local authorities. The Los Angeles Police Department went so far as to establish a bum blockade at the state line, an unconstitutional checkpoint designed to turn back anyone who looked poor or lacked visible means of support. Men who had been proud landowners just months prior were now interrogated like criminals, their poverty treated as a moral failing rather than a tragedy. Those who managed to cross into California found a reality that was starkly different from the postcards of orange groves and sunshine. The sheer number of desperate workers meant that wages for agricultural labor had collapsed, allowing corporate growers to pay starvation rates that barely covered the cost of food. Families who had once owned their own acreage now found themselves living in squalid ditchbank camps or shantytowns made of cardboard and tin, sanitation non-existent and disease rampant. They moved with the harvest, picking cotton, grapes, or peaches from dawn until dusk, their children working alongside them instead of attending school. The social tension between the locals and the migrants was palpable, fueled by fear and the scarcity of resources during the depths of the Depression. The established residents of California viewed the influx of Okies as a threat to their own precarious economic stability, labeling them as dirty, ignorant, and prone to crime. Stores posted signs in their windows reading "No Okies Allowed," and local school boards complained about the burden of educating migrant children. This discrimination created a bitter class divide, isolating the migrants in a subculture of poverty that was distinct from the settled population. In the federal government's attempt to alleviate the suffering, the Farm Security Administration established clean, organized camps that offered a semblance of dignity. These camps, immortalized by the photographs of Dorothea Lange and the prose of John Steinbeck, provided running water, tents with wooden floors, and a democratic committee of residents to settle disputes. For a lucky few, these camps were a sanctuary where they could wash the dust from their skin and regain a sense of community. Yet, for every family in a government camp, there were 10 more living under bridges or in the mud, waiting for a chance to work. The plight of the Dust Bowl refugees highlighted the profound disconnection between the nation's capacity to produce food and its ability to distribute it. While migrant children in the Central Valley suffered from malnutrition and rickets, the government was paying other farmers to destroy crops and slaughter pigs to artificially inflate prices. This paradox of want amidst plenty was a defining moral failure of the era, searing a deep sense of injustice into the consciousness of the American people, the sight of oranges being doused with kerosene to prevent people from eating them, while families starved a few miles away, became a potent symbol of a broken system. Ultimately, the environmental catastrophe of the Dust Bowl and the resulting migration reshaped the demographic landscape of the United States. It tore the heart out of the agrarian Midwest and transplanted a population of tough, resilient survivors to the West Coast, where they would eventually become the backbone of the defense industry. These men and women, hardened by the loss of their land and the brutality of the road, would carry a deep skepticism of authority and a fierce determination to survive into the coming war. The dust eventually settled, but the scars on the land and the memories of the black blizzards would haunt the generation that lived through them forever. Winter 1932. The steel skeletons of the great factories in Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Detroit stand silent and cold against the grey sky, monuments to an industrial age that has ground to a sudden, screeching halt. Where once the air vibrated with the roar of blast furnaces and the rhythmic thumping of assembly lines, there is now only an oppressive, heavy silence that hangs over the cities like a shroud. The gates of the Ford River Rouge complex, once the beating heart of American manufacturing, are locked tight, guarded by men with truncheons who stare down the thousands of former workers gathering outside. These men, huddled in threadbare coats and newspapers, are not there to work, for there is no work to be had. They are there simply because they have nowhere else to go. The urban landscape of America had undergone a grotesque transformation, shifting from a landscape of towering skyscrapers to one of sprawling shantytowns that encircled the major metropolises. These makeshift villages were bitterly christened Hoovervilles in honor of President Herbert Hoover, whom the destitute blamed for their misery. Constructed on muddy riverbanks, in empty lots, and even in the center of Central Park, these shacks were built from the detritus of a failing civilization. Men used flattened tin cans, scrap lumber, tar paper, and rusted car hoods to cobble together shelters that offered little protection against the biting wind. Inside these hovels, entire families lived in a single room, sleeping on piles of rags and cooking meager stews over open fires fueled by scavenged coal. Life within the Hoovervilles was a daily battle for dignity in the face of abject squalor, where sanitation was non-existent and disease spread with terrifying speed. Without running water or sewage systems, the stench of the camps was overpowering, a physical manifestation of the rot at the core of the economy. Yet, a strange social order emerged from the chaos, as doctors, lawyers, and bankers who had lost everything found themselves living side by side with laborers and immigrants. They formed their own mayor systems to settle disputes and shared what little food they could scrounge, united by the great leveling force of poverty. The Hoover flag, an empty pocket turned inside out, became the universal salute of this new, desperate underclass. For those who still had a roof over their heads, the daily reality was a humiliating ritual of waiting in lines that stretched for city blocks. The bread line became the defining visual symbol of the urban depression, a snake of grey hats and slumped shoulders winding around corners in the rain and snow. Proud men who had spent their lives providing for their families now stood for hours to receive a cup of watery soup and a piece of stale bread. In a bitter irony that highlighted the government's paralysis, some of the most efficient soup kitchens in Chicago were funded and operated by the notorious gangster Al Capone, who understood that feeding the hungry bought more loyalty than any politician's promise. The psychological toll on the American patriarch was devastating, dismantling the traditional family structure with a ruthless efficiency. For a generation raised on the ideal that a man's worth was defined by his ability to earn a wage, chronic unemployment was a deep, emasculating wound. Day after day, fathers would leave their homes in the morning, walking miles in shoes lined with cardboard known as Hoover leather, to look for work that didn't exist, simply to maintain the charade of employment for their children. When the shame became too great to bear, many men simply didn't return, hopping freight trains to vanish into the anonymity of the road, leaving behind 1.5 million married women who had been abandoned by their husbands. The collapse of the adult world forced a premature adulthood onto the nation's youth, creating a generation of wild boys and girls who roamed the streets, Schools closed down by the thousands due to lack of funding, leaving millions of students with no education and nothing to do but scour the alleyways for food. In the coal mining districts of Pennsylvania, children as young as 8 scrambled over dangerous slag heaps to salvage pieces of coal to heat their freezing homes, often suffering crushing injuries in the process. Teenagers, feeling like burdens to their starving families, left home in droves, forming roaming wolf packs that rode the rails, dodging brutal railroad bulls and fighting for survival in the jungle camps that dotted the train lines. As the desperation deepened, the passive despair of the early years began to curdle into a volatile, revolutionary anger. In March 1932, this anger erupted at the Ford Hunger March in Dearborn, Michigan, where thousands of unemployed workers marched to the Ford plant to demand jobs and relief. They were met not with negotiation, but with tear gas and live ammunition fired by Ford's private security force and the local police. 4 marchers were killed and dozens wounded on the frozen ground, their blood staining the snow in a stark indictment of a system that seemed to value property rights over human life. The violence at River Rouge sent a chilling message to the nation. The captains of industry were prepared to wage war against their own former employees. This rising tension culminated in the summer of 1932 with the arrival of the Bonus Expeditionary Force, a ragged army of World War I veterans descending on Washington, D.C. These men had been promised a cash bonus for their wartime service, payable in 1945, but with their families starving, they demanded the money immediately, led by a charismatic former sergeant named Walter Waters. Over 43,000 veterans, their wives, and children converged on the capital, hitchhiking and riding freight trains from every corner of the nation. They set up a massive, disciplined encampment on the mudflats of Anacostia, building a city of huts and tents within sight of the Capitol dome, determined to stay until Congress answered their pleas. The Anacostia encampment was a remarkable experiment in integrated democracy, where black and white veterans lived together in harmony, united by their service and their suffering. They organized daily parades, played bugle calls, and maintained strict order to prove they were patriotic citizens, not the communist revolutionaries the government feared. However, President Hoover refused to even meet with the leaders of the Bonus Army, barricading himself in the White House while the police guarded the gates. When the Senate voted down the bill to pay the bonus, the veterans stood on the steps of the Capitol and, instead of rioting, sang America the Beautiful in a haunting display of heartbroken patriotism. Tension reached a breaking point on July 28, when the Attorney General ordered the evacuation of the veterans squatting in abandoned government buildings near Pennsylvania Avenue. The police moved in with batons swinging, triggering a chaotic melee that resulted in officers firing their revolvers into the crowd, killing 2 veterans. Using this violence as a pretext, President Hoover ordered the U.S. Army to clear the Bonus Army from the city, a decision that would lead to one of the darkest moments in American military history. The operation was placed under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, who, convinced that the veterans were a communist front, decided to use overwhelming force to crush the movement. As evening fell, the streets of the capital rumbled with the sound of tanks and the marching boots of infantrymen with fixed bayonets. MacArthur, accompanied by his aides Major Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton, led the assault against the very men they had commanded in the trenches of France just 14 years earlier. The troops launched tear gas grenades into the crowds of veterans and their families, choking the air with chemical smoke that caused panic and confusion. The sight of the American military advancing on unarmed citizens, pushing them back with cavalry charges and sabers, was a shocking spectacle that looked more like a scene from a totalitarian regime than a democracy. The assault continued across the bridge to the main camp at Anacostia Flats, where the soldiers were ordered to burn the shantytown to the ground. As the veterans and their families fled into the darkness, clutching their few meager possessions, the night sky was illuminated by the flames of their burning shelters. The fire consumed everything: the tents, the humble furniture, the American flags that decorated the huts, and the few toys the children possessed. In the chaos, 2 infants reportedly died from the effects of the tear gas, and hundreds of veterans were injured. their service to the nation repaid with fire and steel, the image of the Anacostia camp burning, with the illuminated dome of the Capitol building in the background, was seared into the national consciousness. It was the final moral collapse of the Hoover presidency, a visual confirmation that the government had declared war on its own suffering people. The public reaction was one of horror and revulsion. Even staunch conservatives were appalled by the use of tanks against destitute veterans. The Bonus Army disaster stripped away the last remnants of faith in the current administration, creating a vacuum of leadership that felt dangerously like the prelude to a total societal collapse. In the smoky aftermath of the eviction, the mood in the cities shifted from hopelessness to a grim, determined fury. The talk in the breadlines and the union halls was no longer just about survival, but about systemic change, with radical ideas gaining traction among a population that felt betrayed by capitalism. Communist and fascist organizers found willing listeners among the unemployed, arguing that the American experiment had failed and that a new order was necessary. The United States was balancing on a knife's edge, with the potential for armed insurrection simmering just beneath the surface of daily life. As the winter of 1932 approached, the country faced its darkest hour. With the economic machinery broken, the banking system on the verge of total failure, and the social fabric tearing apart, the cities were filled with the hungry and the homeless, and the smoke from the burning Bonus Army camp still lingered in the political atmosphere. The American people were desperate for a savior, someone who could offer a new deal to a nation that had lost its way. The stage was set for a pivotal election that would decide whether democracy could survive the crushing weight of the Great Depression, or if the United States would follow Europe into the abyss of authoritarianism. March 4th, 1933. A grey, chilling rain sweeps across Washington, D.C., soaking the thousands of spectators huddled before the east portico of the Capitol building. The mood in the crowd is somber, reflecting the desperate state of a nation where the banking system has effectively ceased to exist. Sitting in an open-top limousine, the outgoing President Herbert Hoover stares blankly ahead, a man defeated by history, while beside him sits Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt, paralyzed from the waist down by polio and supporting himself on heavy steel leg braces, painfully maneuvers his way to the podium. He grips the lectern with white-knuckled intensity, using his upper body strength to project an image of unwavering stability to a public that feels the ground crumbling beneath their feet. When Roosevelt's voice booms across the loudspeakers and through the radio receivers of millions of anxious Americans, it carries a tone of aristocratic confidence mixed with genuine empathy. He looks out at the sea of grim faces and delivers the diagnosis that will define his presidency, declaring that the only thing they have to fear is fear itself. This nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, he argues, is what paralyzes efforts to convert retreat into advance. It is a psychological intervention as much as a political speech, designed to break the cycle of panic that has caused citizens to hoard gold and withdraw their life savings. For the first time in 3 years, the American people hear a leader who sounds like he has a plan, even if they do not yet know what it is. The new president wastes no time in translating this rhetoric into decisive action, declaring a 4-day national bank holiday the very next day. The executive order shuts down every financial institution in the country, a radical move intended to stop the hemorrhaging of funds and allow federal inspectors to audit the books. For 4 days, the gears of American commerce grind to a complete halt. Checks cannot be cashed, and people survive on whatever pocket change they have or on credit extended by trusting grocers. It is a gamble of immense proportions, for if the banks reopen and the run on deposits continues, the United States government itself could face insolvency. To ensure the gamble pays off, Roosevelt turns to the radio, pioneering a new form of direct communication with the electorate known as the fireside chat. On the evening of March 12th, families gather around their wooden wireless sets to hear the president explain the complex banking crisis in simple, reassuring terms. He addresses them not as subjects, but as friends, explaining that it is safer to keep their money in a reopened bank than under the mattress. The effect is miraculous. When the banks open their doors on Monday morning, there are lines of people waiting not to withdraw their money, but to deposit it. The panic has been broken not by gold or legislation, but by the restoration of trust in a single man's voice. With the banking crisis stabilized, the administration unleashes a legislative blizzard known as the 100 Days, a period of frenetic activity that fundamentally rewrites the social contract. Roosevelt's brain trust of academic advisors and progressive lawyers drafts bill after bill, which a shell-shocked Congress passes with little debate. Desperate for any solution, the alphabet soup of agencies begins to emerge, starting with the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, led by the chain-smoking, disheveled Harry Hopkins. Hopkins operates with a singular, burning philosophy: people do not eat in the long run. They eat every day. And the government has a moral obligation to prevent starvation immediately, regardless of the cost to the budget. One of the most popular and visibly effective programs to emerge from this flurry of legislation is the Civilian Conservation Corps. It addresses the crisis of the wild boys and unemployed young men by organizing them into paramilitary camps in the nation's forests and parks. 3 million young men, many of whom had never seen a doctor or eaten 3 square meals a day, are shipped out to plant billions of trees, build hiking trails, and fight forest fires. They are paid $30 a month, 25 of which is mandatorily sent back to their struggling families, pumping lifeblood into the local economies while restoring the physical health of a generation wasted by poverty. Simultaneously, the administration tackles the utter collapse of the agricultural sector with the Agricultural Adjustment Act. This controversial measure seeks to raise crop prices by paying farmers to reduce their acreage, essentially paying them not to farm. In a year where millions are hungry, the government orders the slaughter of 6 million pigs and the ploughing under of cotton fields to artificially induce scarcity. While economists argue it is necessary to save the farm economy, the optics of destroying food, while breadlines stretch around city blocks, draws fierce criticism. It highlights the grotesque paradox of the Depression, where the problem is not a lack of resources, but a catastrophic failure of the distribution system. For the industrial sector, the National Recovery Administration attempts to bring order to the chaos of cutthroat competition and falling wages. Under the symbol of the Blue Eagle, which shopkeepers display in their windows to show compliance, industries are encouraged to set codes for fair competition, minimum wages, and maximum working hours. General Hugh Johnson, a bombastic former cavalry officer, leads the charge with parade-like fervor, framing consumer economics as a patriotic duty. Although the NRA would eventually be struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional, for a brief moment, it creates a sense of collective purpose, replacing the dog-eat-dog mentality of the crash with a spirit of managed cooperation. Perhaps the most ambitious of all the New Deal projects is the Tennessee Valley Authority, a massive experiment in regional planning that targets one of the poorest areas in the nation. The TVA constructs a series of hydroelectric dams along the Tennessee River to control the devastating floods that wash away farms every spring and to generate cheap electricity. For rural families who have lived their entire lives by the dim light of kerosene lamps, the arrival of electric light is nothing short of a divine miracle. It brings the modern world of radio, refrigeration, and electric pumps to the backcountry, fundamentally altering the standard of living and proving that the government can be a force for tangible material progress. As the months turn into years, the focus shifts from immediate relief to long-term structural reform, culminating in the Works Progress Administration. This agency becomes the largest employer in the country, hiring millions of unskilled men to build the physical infrastructure of the United States. They construct thousands of bridges, pave hundreds of thousands of miles of roads, and build iconic structures like LaGuardia Airport and the Lodge at Timberline. Critics deride some of these projects as boondoggles, useless work created just to pay a wage, but for the men swinging the hammers. It is the difference between the humiliation of the dole and the dignity of a paycheck. The WPA also breaks new ground by recognizing that artists, writers, and musicians also need to eat, leading to Federal Project No. 1. The government hires playwrights to stage free theatre productions, photographers to document the plight of the rural poor, and painters to cover the walls of post offices with murals celebrating American life. This cultural injection captures the spirit of the era, creating a folk history of the Depression and ensuring that the talents of a generation are not lost to the economic void. It is a bold assertion that the soul of the nation is just as important as its roads and bridges, fostering a sense of shared national identity during a time of fragmentation. However, the New Deal is not without its enemies, who attack Roosevelt from both the right and the left. Conservatives and business leaders form the American Liberty League, accusing the president of being a traitor to his class and steering the country toward socialism. They argue that the massive expansion of federal power and the explosion of the national debt are destroying the Constitution and individual liberty. On the other left, populist demagogues like Senator Huey, the Kingfish Long of Louisiana, roar that the New Deal has not gone far enough. Long captivates millions with his Share Our Wealth program, promising to confiscate the fortunes of the rich to guarantee every American family a home, a car, and a radio. A seductive message that forces Roosevelt to move further to the left. In response to this pressure and the persistent economic stagnation, the administration launches the Second New Deal in 1935, the crown jewel of which is the Social Security Act, championed by Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins, the first woman to hold a cabinet post. This legislation creates a safety net for the elderly, the unemployed, and the disabled. It represents a fundamental shift in the American philosophy of government, establishing the principle that the state has a responsibility to protect its citizens from the harsh vagaries of the free market. For the first time, getting old does not necessarily mean falling into destitution, a change that provides a sense of security to millions of anxious workers. The battles with the Supreme Court, which repeatedly strikes down key pillars of the New Deal, lead Roosevelt to his biggest political blunder, the court-packing scheme of 1937. Frustrated by the 9 old men who block his agenda, FDR proposes adding more justices to the bench to dilute their influence. The move is widely seen as a power grab and a threat to the separation of powers, costing him significant political capital and emboldening his opposition. It serves as a reminder that even a popular president with a mandate for change cannot simply rewrite the rules of the Republic to suit his timeline. By the end of the 1930 seconds, the alphabet agencies have not ended the Great Depression, but they have fundamentally altered the psychology of the nation. The unemployment rate remains stubbornly high, and the economy has not returned to 1929 levels. But the pervasive sense of panic has been replaced by a grim endurance. The government has established itself as the guarantor of economic welfare, creating a buffer between the citizen and the abyss. Yet, as the domestic fires are brought under control, the eyes of the administration begin to turn anxiously toward the horizon, where the failure of the global economy is fueling a much darker and more dangerous fire in the heart of Europe. Summer 1931. The grand banking halls of Vienna are usually bastions of silence and stability. But today the Kreditanstalt, the most powerful financial institution in Central Europe, is a scene of utter bedlam. A nervous crowd of thousands presses against the ornate brass doors, clutching savings books and demanding the return of their life's work in hard currency. Inside the boardroom, the directors stare at ledgers that bleed red ink, realizing that the intricate web of international loans that has sustained the European economy since the Great War is unraveling. The collapse of this single Austrian bank sends a seismic shockwave across the continent, signaling to the world that the American contagion has mutated into a global plague that no border can stop. The roots of this transatlantic disaster lay in the fragile and circular economic system established by the Treaty of Versailles and the Dawes Plan. Throughout the 1920 seconds, the American financial sector acted as the engine for the entire world, lending billions of dollars to a defeated Germany so it could pay war reparations to Britain and France. These nations, in turn, used that money to repay their massive war debts to the United States, creating a cycle of capital that flowed smoothly as long as the American economy was booming. When Wall Street crashed, the American banks frantically recalled their foreign loans to cover their domestic losses, effectively pulling the plug on the life support system of the Weimar Republic. In Germany, the sudden withdrawal of American capital hit with the force of a sledgehammer, shattering the precarious stability of the young democracy. Factories in the Ruhr Valley, dependent on foreign credit to purchase raw materials, shut down overnight, throwing millions of men onto the streets of Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich. The unemployment rate skyrocketed to terrifying levels, with 1 in 3 German workers unable to find a job, creating a vast army of the disaffected and the desperate. Unlike the Americans, who had centuries of democratic tradition to fall back on, the German people had only a decade of chaotic republicanism that was now associated with humiliation and poverty. The psychological trauma of this new depression was compounded by the lingering scars of the hyperinflation crisis of 1923, destroying what little faith remained in the moderate centrist parties. The German middle class, having seen their savings wiped out twice in one generation, began to look for radical solutions to their existential misery. In the beer halls and on the street corners, political extremists from both the far left and the far right began to gain traction, promising to tear down the corrupt system. The communists preached a workers' revolution, while the National Socialists, led by Adolf Hitler, offered a seductive narrative of racial superiority and national rebirth. As the economic misery deepened, the streets of German cities became battlegrounds where the paramilitary wings of these rival factions fought for control of the pavement. The Nazi SA, or brown shirts, set up soup kitchens to feed the hungry, using bread and soup as recruiting tools for their violent cause. They directed the anger of the unemployed away from the global economic forces and toward convenient scapegoats, blaming the Jews and the Treaty of Versailles for the nation's suffering. For a jobless mechanic or a bankrupt shopkeeper, the sight of marching men in uniform offered a sense of order and purpose in a world that had seemingly gone mad. While Europe burned, the United States government made a catastrophic error that poured gasoline on the fire. The passage of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930, intended to protect American farmers and manufacturers from foreign competition. The act raised import duties to record highs, effectively closing the American market to the rest of the world. It was a move born of economic nationalism, but the result was a brutal trade war, as other nations immediately retaliated with their own tariffs against American goods. Within months, the flow of international commerce froze, and global trade volumes plummeted by more than 60%, destroying the export industries that were the lifeline of many nations. The impact of this trade collapse was particularly devastating for the Empire of Japan, a nation with few natural resources that relied heavily on international trade to feed its growing population. The American market for Japanese silk, a luxury good that sustained millions of rural farming households, evaporated overnight as destitute Americans stopped buying expensive stockings. The price of silk collapsed, plunging the Japanese countryside into a famine so severe that impoverished farmers were forced to sell their daughters into prostitution just to survive. The desperation in the villages created a deep well of resentment against the Western powers and the capitalist system that appeared to have betrayed them. This economic catastrophe undermined the legitimacy of the liberal civilian government in Tokyo, which seemed powerless to stop the suffering. The void was filled by ultranationalist military officers who argued that Japan could no longer rely on trade with a hostile West, but must seize its own resources by force. They envisioned a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, an autarkic empire where Japan would control the oil, rubber, and rice it needed to be self-sufficient. The military began to operate independently of the civilian government, assassinating moderate politicians who advocated for diplomacy and intimidation of anyone who spoke out against expansionism. In September 1931, arguably the first shot of the Second World War was fired not in Europe, but in Manchuria. Japanese officers staged a bombing of a railway line near Mukden, a false flag operation known as the Mukden Incident, and used it as a pretext to invade and occupy the entire resource-rich province of northeast China. This aggression was a direct result of the Great Depression. The Japanese army saw Manchuria as a necessary lifeline, a breadbasket, and a source of raw materials that would insulate Japan from the vagaries of the global market. The civilian government in Tokyo, fearful of a coup, acquiesced to the conquest, marking the end of Japanese democracy. The invasion of Manchuria presented the first major test for the League of Nations, the international body created after the Great War to prevent future conflicts. China pleaded for assistance, and the League dispatched a commission to investigate, eventually condemning Japan's actions. However, without the economic strength of the United States, which was not a member, and with Britain and France too consumed by their own domestic economic crises to intervene. The League was toothless. Japan simply walked out of the assembly, exposing the collective security system as a hollow shell and signaling to dictators everywhere that aggression would go unpunished. Back in Europe, the financial contagion finally crossed the English Channel, forcing the British Empire to make a humiliating admission of defeat. In September 1931, facing a run on the pound sterling, the British government abandoned the gold standard, the bedrock of the global financial system for a century. This devaluation shocked the world, effectively declaring that the old rules of stability and convertibility were dead. It triggered a chaotic currency war as nations competitively devalued their money to try and boost exports, further destabilizing the international order and wiping out the savings of the middle class in countries that held British debt. In the vacuum of leadership, nations began to retreat into autarky, or economic self-sufficiency, building high walls around their empires to lock out foreign goods. The British established the imperial preference system, favouring trade within the Commonwealth and shutting out other nations, which particularly hurt Germany and Japan. The world was fragmenting into hostile economic blocs, each viewing the other with suspicion and seeing trade not as a mutual benefit, but as a zero-sum game. This economic balkanization made war increasingly inevitable, as nations that could not trade for the resources they needed felt compelled to take them by conquest. France, which had initially been insulated from the worst of the crash due to its large gold reserves and agricultural economy, began to succumb to the depression later than its neighbours. By the mid-1932s, the French Third Republic was beset by political instability, with governments falling every few months and street riots becoming commonplace. The polarization of French society between the communist left and the fascist right mirrored the situation in Germany, leaving the nation paralyzed and unable to formulate a coherent response to the rising threat across the Rhine. The internal rot weakened France's resolve, creating a dangerous fragility in the only continental power capable of checking German aggression. As the decade wore on, the distinction between economic policy and military preparation began to blur. In Germany, the Nazi regime, having seized power in 1933, tackled unemployment through a massive rearmament program that violated the Treaty of Versailles. The roaring factories that ended the Depression in Germany were not producing consumer goods, but tanks, aircraft, and munitions. This military Keynesianism created an artificial boom that was unsustainable without war. The Nazi economy was a Ponzi scheme that required the plunder of conquered territories to keep from collapsing. By the late 1932s, the Great Depression had effectively dismantled the international order that had maintained the peace since 1918. The economic despair had empowered totalitarian regimes, destroyed the credibility of democratic capitalism, and convinced nations that survival depended on military strength rather than international cooperation. The hungry men of 1931 who had marched for bread were now being fitted for uniforms, handed rifles, and told that the solution to their poverty lay in the conquest of their neighbours. The stage was set for a conflict that would be fought not just for territory, but for the very resources required to sustain modern industrial life. October 5th, 1937. The wind whips off Lake Michigan, chilling the thousands of people gathered to hear President Roosevelt speak at the dedication of the Outer Link Bridge in Chicago. In the heart of the isolationist Midwest, a region that views European affairs with deep suspicion, FDR decides to take a calculated political risk. He steps away from the safe topics of infrastructure and unemployment to deliver a warning about the epidemic of world lawlessness spreading across the globe. He suggests that peace-loving nations must quarantine the aggressors to stop the contagion of war, a metaphor drawn from the public health crises of the era. The silence that follows is not one of agreement, but of shock, as the crowd realizes their president is suggesting that the United States can no longer remain an island unto itself. The backlash to the quarantine speech was immediate and ferocious, revealing the depth of the isolationist sentiment that gripped the nation. Newspaper editorials from the Chicago Tribune to the Hearst papers accused Roosevelt of being a warmonger, trying to drag American boys into another senseless European slaughter to distract from his economic failures. This fierce resistance was rooted in the findings of the WWII Committee, A Senate investigation launched in 1934 that had spent years examining the causes of the First World War. The committee, led by Senator Gerald Nye, had painted a cynical picture of the Great War not as a defense of democracy, but as a conflict manufactured by merchants of death, greedy arms manufacturers and bankers who had profited from the blood of soldiers, determined to never be duped again. Congress had bound the president's hands with a series of neutrality acts passed between 1935 and 1937. These laws were a legislative fortress designed to keep the United States out of foreign entanglements by strictly prohibiting the export of arms, ammunition, and implements of war to any belligerent nations. They also forbade American citizens from traveling on ships owned by warring countries, a direct response to the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. The legislation made no moral distinction between the aggressor and the victim, whether it was fascist Italy invading Ethiopia or the democratic Spanish Republic fighting for its life. The American embargo applied equally to both. While America legislated its own blindness, the dictators of the world interpreted this withdrawal as a green light for conquest. In October 1935, Benito Mussolini, dreaming of a new Roman Empire, ordered the Italian army to invade the independent African nation of Ethiopia. The world watched in horror as Italian bombers rained mustard gas down on barefoot Ethiopian soldiers armed with antiquated rifles and spears. Emperor Haile Selassie stood before the League of Nations in Geneva, a diminutive figure with a prophetic voice, pleading for collective security and warning the Western powers. It is us today. It will be you tomorrow. The League, crippled by the absence of the United States and the cowardice of Britain and France, did nothing but issue weak sanctions that excluded oil, the one resource Mussolini actually needed. Emboldened by the League's impotence, Adolf Hitler made his first major gamble in March 1936 by ordering German troops to reoccupy the Rhineland. This demilitarized zone, established by the Treaty of Versailles as a buffer between Germany and France, was the tripwire for European security. As the Wehrmacht soldiers marched across the bridges of the Rhine, terrified of a French counterattack that would have easily crushed them, they were met only with silence. France, paralyzed by political infighting and a deep fear of another war, refused to move without British support, and Britain argued that Germany was merely walking into its own backyard. It was the fatal moment when the dictator could have been stopped without a shot being fired. But the democracies blinked. The testing ground for the new machinery of war became the Spanish Civil War, which erupted in the summer of 1936. While the Western democracies stuck rigidly to their policy of non-intervention, Hitler and Mussolini poured men, tanks, and aircraft into Spain to support the fascist rebellion of General Francisco Franco. The conflict became a proxy war where the Luftwaffe honed the tactics of the Blitzkrieg, learning how to coordinate air power with ground movements. The horror of this new warfare was immortalized in April 1937, when the German Condor Legion carpet-bombed the small Basque market town of Guernica. Incendiary bombs turned the town into an inferno, deliberately targeting civilians to break their morale, a terrifying preview of the total war that was to come. In the United States, the reaction to these atrocities was a complex mixture of moral outrage and a reinforced desire to stay away. Americans watched newsreels of the bombing of Shanghai and the rape of Nanking, where Japanese troops committed unspeakable barbarity against the Chinese population, but they watched from the safety of dark movie theaters. The psychological distance was vast. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were viewed as giant moats that protected the new world from the madness of the old. When Japanese warplanes sank the American gunboat USS Panay in the Yangtze River in December 1937, killing 3 sailors, the public demand was not for war, but for the immediate withdrawal of all American forces from China to avoid further incidents. This profound isolationism coalesced into a powerful political movement with the formation of the America First Committee in 1940. It was a broad coalition that included future President Gerald Ford, Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, and its most famous spokesman, the aviation hero Charles Lindbergh, the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic. used his immense celebrity to argue that Britain was already lost and that the United States should negotiate with Hitler rather than fight him. At massive rallies that filled Madison Square Garden, Lindbergh warned that subversive elements, a thinly veiled reference to the British, the Roosevelt administration, and the Jews were conspiring to push the country into a war that was not in its national interest. Faced with this domestic wall of opposition, Roosevelt was forced to play a double game, publicly promising peace while secretly preparing for war. He began to slowly chip away at the Neutrality Acts, convincing Congress to allow a cash-and-carry provision that permitted the sale of arms to belligerents if they paid in cash and used their own ships. It was a loophole designed to help Britain and France, who controlled the seas, without risking American vessels. Simultaneously, he quietly began to ramp up American defense spending, ordering the construction of new battleships and aircraft factories, arguing that a strong defense was the best deterrent against aggression. Across the Atlantic, the policy of appeasement reached its tragic climax in September 1938 at the Munich Conference. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, a man haunted by the slaughter of the Somme, flew to Germany to negotiate with Hitler over the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia, desperate to avoid war at any cost. Chamberlain and the French leadership agreed to hand over the territory to Germany in exchange for Hitler's signature on a piece of paper promising no further territorial demands. Chamberlain returned to London waving the document, declaring he had secured peace for our time, while the Czechs, who were not even invited to the meeting, were forced to surrender their border defences and their industrial heartland. The illusion of peace lasted less than 6 months. In March 1939, Hitler shattered the Munich Agreement by invading and occupying the rest of Czechoslovakia, proving once and for all that his word was worthless and his appetite for conquest insatiable. The scales finally fell from the eyes of the British and French public. They realized that war was not just a possibility, but an inevitability. They frantically began to issue guarantees to Poland, the next likely target, drawing a line in the sand that they knew would be crossed. In Washington, Roosevelt watched the map of Europe turning brown with Nazi domination, knowing that the quarantine had failed and the plague was about to consume the continent. The darkness deepened in November 1938 with Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, a state-sponsored pogrom across Germany and Austria. Nazi stormtroopers burned over 1,000 synagogues, ransacked Jewish businesses, and rounded up 30,000 Jewish men for deportation to concentration camps. The American press reported the violence in graphic detail, shocking the conscience of the nation and stripping away any lingering romanticism about the new Germany. Yet, even in the face of this humanitarian crisis, the walls of Fortress America remained high. A bill to admit 20,000 Jewish refugee children was defeated in Congress, driven by anti-Semitism and the fear that refugees would steal jobs from unemployed Americans. As the summer of 1939 approached, the world held its breath, waiting for the spark that would ignite the powder keg. The Soviet Union, the ideological arch-enemy of fascism, shocked the world by signing a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a cynical marriage of convenience that carved up Eastern Europe between the two totalitarian giants and removed the threat of a two-front war for Germany. It was the final signal that the attack was imminent. In the humid heat of late August, the lights began to go out all over Europe as cities enforced blackouts. Children were evacuated to the countryside, and men said goodbye to their families at train stations, just as their fathers had done 20 years before. In the White House, the mood was one of grim resignation. Roosevelt spent his nights by the radio, monitoring the deteriorating situation, knowing that the United States was woefully unprepared for the conflict that was about to erupt. The American army was smaller than that of Portugal, equipped with World War I surplus rifles and trucks that still wore the paint of the Western Front. The industrial might that would eventually crush the Axis was still dormant, idling in the slow recovery of the Depression. The president knew that before he could defeat Hitler, he would first have to defeat the paralysis of his own people, convincing them that the ocean was no longer a shield, but a highway for invasion. The rise of shadows was complete. The democratic powers, through a combination of economic exhaustion, political cowardice, and wishful thinking had allowed the fascist regimes to rearm, expand, and position themselves for global domination. The era of diplomacy was over. The era of iron and fire was about to begin. As the sun set on August 31st, 1939, the German army massed on the Polish border. Millions of men and thousands of tanks poised to unleash a new kind of war that would make the horrors of the trenches look like a skirmish. The sleeping giant of America slumbered on, but the alarm was about to ring with a violence that would shake the foundations of the world. September 1st, 1939, 3:00 a.m. The phone rings in the bedroom of the White House, jarring President Roosevelt awake. On the other end of the line is Ambassador William Bullitt in Paris, his voice trembling with the weight of the message he has to deliver. Mr. President, several German divisions are deep in Polish territory. There are reports of bombers over Warsaw. Roosevelt hangs up, the silence of the room heavy with the realization that the nightmare has finally begun. He calls his cabinet, and then, in a somber radio address to the nation, he declares that while the United States will remain officially neutral, he cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. The pretense of indifference is over, the world is on fire, and the heat is already being felt across the Atlantic. The initial American reaction to the outbreak of war in Europe is a strange mixture of relief that they are not involved and a growing anxiety that they soon will be. For the first few months, known as the Phony War, life in the United States continues largely unchanged, but the illusion of distance is shattered in the spring of 1940, when the German war machine turns west. In just 6 weeks, the Wehrmacht does what it failed to do in 4 years of trench warfare. It crushes the French army, the supposed finest land force in Europe. The sight of Nazi troops marching under the Arc de Triomphe sends a shockwave of terror through Washington. The Atlantic Ocean suddenly feels like a very narrow stream, and the realization hits that Britain is the only thing standing between Hitler and the Americas. Faced with this existential threat, the American giant begins to stir from its slumber. Roosevelt creates the National Defense Advisory Commission to oversee the conversion of the economy, bringing captains of industry into the government, the very men he had demonized during the New Deal. He asks Congress for a massive appropriation to build 50,000 airplanes a year, a number so astronomically high that even his own advisors think he has lost his mind. But the money begins to flow, and for the first time in a decade, the help wanted signs begin to appear on factory gates in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles. The rust is scraped off the machines, and the fires are relit in the blast furnaces. In September 1940, in a move of unprecedented political courage during an election year, FDR signs the Selective Training and Service Act, the first peacetime draft in American history. Millions of young men, many of whom have known only hunger and unemployment, report to local draft boards to register. They are raw, underfed, and drilled with wooden rifles because there aren't enough real ones to go around. But they represent the nucleus of the army that will liberate Europe. The draft also serves an economic function. It begins to drain the surplus labor pool that had plagued the nation for 10 years, absorbing the unemployed into the ranks of the military. The transition from neutrality to non-belligerency accelerates with the passage of the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941. Roosevelt sells the idea to the public with a masterstroke of folksy analogy: if your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't haggle over the price of your garden hose. You lend it to him to put out the fire, and he gives it back later. The act authorizes the president to lend or lease military equipment to any nation whose defense is deemed vital to the United States. It effectively ends American neutrality, turning the country into the arsenal of democracy. American factories begin to hum around the clock, producing tanks for the British in North Africa and trucks for the Soviets fighting on the Eastern Front. Then comes the day that changes everything. December 7th, 1941. A quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii is shattered by the whine of Japanese Zeros and the thunder of exploding torpedoes. The attack on Pearl Harbor kills over 200 Americans and destroys the battleships of the Pacific Fleet, but it accomplishes something that no politician could. It instantly unifies the American people. The isolationist movement evaporates overnight. The America First Committee dissolves, and its members, including Charles Lindbergh, rally behind the flag. The debate is over. The Great Depression mindset of scarcity and survival is instantly replaced by a singular, burning national purpose, total victory. The mobilization that follows is the greatest industrial miracle in human history. The War Production Board, led by Donald Nelson, assumes dictatorial powers over the economy, ordering the immediate cessation of civilian automobile production. The iconic assembly lines of the big three automakers Ford, GM, and Chrysler are ripped out and replaced with tooling to build B-24 Liberator bombers, Sherman tanks, and aircraft engines. The Ford Willow Run plant in Michigan becomes a symbol of this transformation. A factory so vast it has its own microclimate, turning out one heavy bomber every hour. The United States does not just outfight its enemies, it outproduces them by an order of magnitude, burying the Axis powers under an avalanche of steel and aluminum. This insatiable demand for labor finally solves the riddle of the Great Depression. The unemployment rate, which had hovered around 15% in 1940, crashes to 2% by 1944. In fact, the problem shifts from a lack of jobs to a severe shortage of workers. With 16 million men serving in the armed forces, the factories turn to the only untapped labor reserve left: women. Rosie the Riveter becomes the cultural icon of the home front, as millions of housewives, waitresses, and secretaries don overalls and welding masks. They build ships in the Kaiser shipyards of California and pack ammunition in the arsenals of the Midwest, proving that they can do men's work and fundamentally altering the gender dynamics of American society. The war also triggers a massive demographic upheaval. The Second Great Migration sees over 1 million African Americans leave the segregation and poverty of the rural South for the defense jobs in the North and West. They find work in the shipyards of Oakland and the steel mills of Gary, escaping the Jim Crow laws only to face new forms of discrimination in crowded, segregated defense housing. Yet, their contribution is vital, and the WWII campaign victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home plants the seeds for the civil rights movement of the post-war era. The war mixes Americans together like never before, throwing Brooklyn Jews, Texas ranchers, and Iowa farmers into the same foxholes and factory floors. To pay for this colossal effort, the government revolutionizes the tax system. The Revenue Act of 1942 transforms the income tax from a levy on the rich into a mass tax paid by almost everyone, introducing the system of payroll, withholding that exists to this day. To cover the rest of the cost, the government launches massive war bond drives, using Hollywood stars and emotional propaganda to encourage citizens to lend their savings to Uncle Sam. It works. The American people save money at a record rate, not because they are hoarding out of fear, but because there is nothing to buy cars, refrigerators, and nylons are non-existent, and food is strictly rationed with coupon books. By 1944, the United States is producing 40% of the world's armaments. The economy has doubled in size in just 5 years, a feat of expansion that defies all economic logic. The standard of living for the average American actually rises during the war, despite the rationing, as wages skyrocket and overtime pay becomes the norm. The Great Depression is not just over, it has been obliterated by the sheer velocity of the war economy. The government spending that the New Deal had attempted on a small scale is now being executed on a level that Keynes could only have dreamed of, proving once and for all that massive public investment can drive full employment. The end of the war in 1945 leaves the United States in a position of global dominance that is unprecedented in history. While Europe and Asia lie in ruins, their cities flattened and their economies destroyed, the American homeland is untouched. Its factories are intact, its workforce is trained and flush with savings, and its technology is supreme. The dollar replaces the pound sterling as the world's reserve currency, and the American way of life becomes the envy of the globe. The WWII bill guarantees that the returning veterans will not face the same breadlines their fathers did, offering them free college education and low-interest home loans that will build the modern middle class. However, the victory is won by a generation that was forged in the fires of the Depression. The men who stormed the beaches of Normandy and Iwo Jima were the same boys who had ridden the rails in search of work, who had seen their fathers weep over foreclosed farms, and who had learned to survive on grit and determination. The hardships of the 1,930 seconds had toughened them, stripping away any sense of entitlement and replacing it with a stoic resilience that served them well in the foxholes. They had learned that life was not fair, that disaster could strike at any moment, and that the only way to survive was to rely on one another. As the documentary closes, we see a montage of the victory celebrations, the ticker tape parades in New York, the sailors kissing nurses in Times Square, and the tearful reunions at train stations. But the camera lingers on the faces of the older generation, the parents who lived through the crash of '29 and the Dust Bowl. In their eyes, there is more than just joy. There is a profound sense of relief. They have survived the two greatest cataclysms of the 20th century, the Great Depression and the Second World War. They have walked through the valley of the shadow of death and emerged on the other side, not just intact, but stronger. The story of the Great Depression is ultimately a story of transformation. It began with the collapse of an old world order, a gilded age of excess that was built on sand. It ended with the birth of a superpower, forged in the crucible of suffering and war. The United States that emerged in 1945 was a fundamentally different nation than the one that entered the 1,930 seconds more equal, more powerful, and more aware of its responsibilities to its own citizens and to the world. The scars of the Depression would never fully heal. Grandmothers would forever hoard canned goods, and grandfathers would never trust the stock market, but those scars would serve as a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. The sleeping giant had awoken, and the world would never be the same again.